Superman debuted in Action Comics #1, June 1938. The origins of Superman and its development, though, date back 5 years. In January 1933, Jerry Siegel published a short story, The Reign of the Superman, in his fanzine. That story included illustrations by Joe Shuster. Siegel was very interested in developing this character, and he reformulated it and turned the Superman of his original story into Superman and moved him from being a bad guy to a hero. But it took him some years to develop the character. In 1934, he asked Russell Keaton, the ghost artist on Buck Rogers, to help him develop a comic strip. And the two cooperated and developed a few trial releases for a Superman comic strip version, but unfortunately for Jerry Siegel, that didn't go anywhere. In 1935, he started to work again with Joe Shuster on the character, and they worked up some comic strip versions of the character, but again, they weren't able to get any of the newspaper syndicates interested in that, and eventually it was picked up by Detective Comics for their new comic book, Action Comics #1. Superman very quickly became an extraordinarily popular comic book. Action Comics #1 tended to sell better if Superman was on the cover, and quickly Action Comics, which included other comic features other than Superman, it tended to feature more and more Superman on the cover. It was so successful that a Superman comic book was launched also by DC. Superman grew into an iconic status rather quickly, and part of the reason for that, I think, is that during World War II, many service people read the comic book because it was readily attainable. Also, very quickly, DC expanded the reach of Superman by licensing a newspaper comic strip, by helping create a radio serial, and also by licensing animated cartoons of the character. They also licensed the character to toy manufacturers like Daisy Toys, who produced toys featuring Superman. So all of these things were important in creating this kind of iconic status. You could not only read Superman, you could buy products that contained his image. This kind of involvement, and it's multi-generational, from children to adults reading Superman in some form or another, in comic books or in comic strips, or hearing him on the radio, or seeing the animated cartoons. This kind of multi-generational status for the character started to create this iconic figure in American culture. There are several ways that Superman demonstrates cultural myth-making as a collective and dynamic process. Perhaps one of the most interesting is the Superman wink. In Superman comic book number 19 from November 1942, Superman goes to, or actually Clark Kent, goes to see the Fleischer Brothers animated cartoon with Lois Lane. And the comic book story depicts this, this moment by showing Clark and Lois in the theater, and the panels that represent what's happening on the screen have little movie sockets down the side. At the end of this story, the on-screen Superman winks to Clark Kent in the movie theater. it's a very interesting moment in Superman's history. It does create the wink. And one of the other places in which the wink takes place is in other Superman stories, particularly in the 1950s television series, The Adventures of Superman. After the first season, it became quite common for the show to end a particular episode with Clark Kent or Superman turning to the audience, kind of breaking the fourth wall, and winking at the audience in a knowing fashion, indicating that the audience was in on the fact that he was Superman, whereas Perry White, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Inspector Henderson, and so forth didn't quite know that he was Superman. So this wink was so important that when Alan Moore was writing a story to kind of wrap up in some ways a particular version of Superman up to the mid-80s, a story called Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, he used the wink in that story. So this becomes a moment across various media forms where this cultural myth-making occurs as Superman winking. But there's another version where something like this happens, and that's Superman changing clothes in telephone booths. And this shows some of the ways in which Superman's audience, his readers, his viewers, help shape the character. In 1967, somebody wrote to DC Comics, and it was published on the letters page, asking about Superman changing in the telephone booth. And what happened was that DC really didn't quite know its own history readily, and it then touched off a series of letters trying to establish where Superman had first changed in a telephone booth. Superman actually had first changed into a telephone booth in a Fleish's Brother cartoon in the 1940s, and occasionally he had in the comic book. But after 1967, it eventually, slowly, between 67 and 72, became such a thing that the letters page was headed with Superman or Clark Kent moving through a telephone booth and changing clothes. And this was the sort of letterhead for the letters page. This then became such a thing that Superman changed in a phone booth that there was a sight gag in Richard Donner's 1978 movie Superman, in which Christopher Reeve, looking for a place to change, looks at a telephone box, but of course they're no longer telephone booths, they're just those freestanding payphones that used to exist, and of course even those no longer exist. It's such a thing that you can buy an iPhone cover that features Superman changing in a telephone booth, which is kind of the most ironic thing around, that the very technology that has completely wiped out payphones, let alone phone booths, features this iconic moment of Superman. So I think that's just a delightful little instance of cultural myth-making around the character, and we get this kind of particular notion of how the character exists through fans and through then various other versions, including something we can buy and put on our iPhones. Well, there are quite a few significant instances of Superman, both in comic books and in other forms of media. Beyond Action Comics #1, probably one of the most important developments for Superman was the radio serial. And why I say that is because this is where the catchphrase that we so often associate with Superman first developed. Robert Maxwell, the producer of the show, eventually combined elements from both the radio series, the introduction to it that they'd been using, and some other phrases that had been introduced by the Fleischer brothers in their animated cartoon versions of Superman to create the phrase Superman fights for truth, justice, and the American way. Something that really resonates across generations and is still a very important part of Superman's character. So the radio serial, in developing that, that phrase played a very important role in shaping Superman in people's minds. Perhaps more important in some ways than the radio serial was the 1950s television show, The Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves. That show, of course, used that same opening as the radio serial, which concludes that Superman, who disguised as Clark Kent, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way, against the backdrop of Clark Kent morphing into Superman, the change between the suit and the superhero uniform, against the backdrop of an American flag. And I think this really cemented Superman's iconic status in the minds of the baby boomers, and this was very, very important to the character. Another important instance in Superman's history was the Richard Donner 1978 Superman film. That film was marketed as "You'll Believe a Man Can Fly," and truly it did pull that off, but more importantly, it gave an updated version of Superman for a more mature audience, the growing-up baby boomers who had watched the 1950s TV show. And through some nice synergy, Christopher Reeve sounded just enough like George Reeves in some ways that it just gave this nice little tie-in that didn't really exist but helped it. So those are very significant moments in the history of Superman outside of comic books. Within comic books, there are numerous instances of it, but perhaps the one that most people will still remember is the death of Superman from the early 90s. What happened there, this again demonstrated Superman's iconic status. It triggered off an avalanche of people seeking to own a small piece of Superman, hoping to cash in at some point, because the origins of Superman in Action Comics #1, that comic had become a very collectible item and it was worth a lot. And for some reason, many people thought that a copy of The Death of Superman would become a collectible because of his iconic status. Now, of course, the market overheated and millions of copies of those comic books were sold, and this almost was a contributing factor in some ways, at least that's how the story goes, to a decline in comic book sales for some years. So these are big moments in the history of Superman. Of course, Superman came back, and he always was going to come back. If you read comic books, you knew that. But those are the big moments in Superman's history in various forms of media.